All right, so this is the first presentation over Europe, and just like with the other units, we're going to start with physical geography, and then we'll move into like human environment interaction, and then of course the history of the region. All right, so first off, Eurasia. So that's the name of the continent when you combine Europe and Asia together. So if we were studying geography in Europe, they would learn it as one massive continent called Eurasia. So of course we study Europe and Asia separately because we see them as having completely different cultures, different history and background and stuff like that. So that's why we divide those continents up and not just see it as just one massive continent because their history is just too different. The languages are different from each other, and things like that. Now, looking at Europe's latitude, Europe is pretty far north. So if you were to just scoot it over the United States, that's how much room it would take up, and that's also where it would be in relation to the U.S. So you see it's really far north, but they actually have good weather. So like London, for example, if it was in that part of Canada, it would be freezing during the winter. But during the winter in London with where it is, it doesn't snow that much. It's actually about the same as Dallas, a little bit colder, but not that bad considering it's that far north. And that's because the fact that they're near the ocean, they have a warm ocean current, and they also get the westerlies coming from the United States that make it nice and warm. So even though it's really far north, generally it has good weather. All right, and then comparing the U.S. to the Soviet Union, to Russia, Russia's a lot bigger. It's a sixth of all the land on Earth. They take up almost half the time zones that we have on Earth. To give you an idea, the distance from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok is about the same as it is from here to London. So it's a huge country, and we'll talk more about Russia later. All right, so Europe is basically a giant peninsula, and then it has peninsulas within peninsulas. And so this can be good for Europe as far as climate goes, because since they're near the ocean, it's going to moderate their climate more, which makes it nicer, which is what I was just talking about. Of course, it's more access to ports for trade, and of course access to seafood, which is a healthier diet as well, eating more fish in their diet, especially in the Mediterranean. And then, of course, a negative could be is, being invaded. There's a lot of places you can land on Europe and invade different countries around the area, and things like that. And, of course, not every country has equal access to the sea as well. But overall, it's been really good for them. So, one of the key questions for this presentation is how has the physical geography of Europe and the climate of Europe been a positive or negative for the people that live there? And so that's just a couple of the positives and negatives right there. So now your different regions. You have Western Europe. You need to know that's the richest part of Europe. So that's where we see more capitalism, democracies, things like that in Western Europe. Northern Europe, so Scandinavia, it's Norway, Sweden, Finland, is more socialist. So you can see high income taxes, but they also provide a lot of services for their people. And then Eastern Europe is the poorest part of Europe, and that region used to be part of the Soviet Union. So they were communist until 1991. So a lot of these countries are newly independent. But that's also why they're struggling. All right, Northern European Plain. So this flat area goes from France through Germany, Poland, over into Russia, and this is the main area for farming. And so there's also a really good soil here called Chernozem, which is a black soil that's high in nutrients. And so your early settlers in Europe, they settled along this plain, obviously for farming purposes. Of course, a negative about being on a plain, especially back in medieval times or something like that, is that it offers no natural protection. And so this is why you see the building of castles and things like that to create protection for the people, because the land didn't offer protection in that area. All right, now your different peninsulas, and you know all these as well. So you have the Scandinavian peninsula up here in the north, so it's Norway, Sweden, and Finland. The Jutland Peninsula, where Denmark is. The Iberian Peninsula with Spain and Portugal. The Italian Peninsula, which is, of course, Italy. And then the Balkan Peninsula, which is several countries, Greece being at the bottom. All right, so Scandinavian, just as I said, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. You just need to know it's really cold, and that's where you see more socialist governments. Also, the Arctic Circle goes through the Scandinavian Peninsula, so because of that, most of the people are going to live in the south, obviously, away from the Arctic Circle. All right, a fjord. So we see this in Scandinavia. A fjord is a U-shaped valley that's been shaped out by glaciers. So during the Ice Age, they retreated and carved out these fjords and then, of course, melted and created lakes. And so these lakes are so clean, you can actually drink straight from them. So it's a great place. Like if you love the outdoors and stuff like that, then Scandinavia is a really good place to go on vacation. A lot of really good hiking, mountain climbing, kayaking, things like that. All right, the Jutland Peninsula, that's where Denmark is. It's just north of Germany. The Iberian Peninsula, as I said, is Portugal and Spain, as you can see there on the satellite image. So right here, we'll talk about these in a minute. The Pyrenees Mountains separate the Iberian Peninsula from France up there. And then, of course, the Italian Peninsula is Italy. That's pretty straightforward. You can see, of course, Italy right there. And then the Balkan Peninsula, so this area, like I said, Greece is at the bottom of it. This is the most volatile area of Europe. There was a genocide in this region just about 16 years ago. They started World War I. They had a huge war in the 90s. We'll talk about that later, but it's getting better now. So, but especially in the 20th century, it was pretty volatile. So that's the Balkan Peninsula. So all of this region here as well. So generally pretty poor countries. Greece is, I can't say they're doing better. Having problems right now. The safest countries to go to in this region are still Greece and Croatia as well. Croatia's improved actually quite a bit recently. Then strategic waterways. There's three main strategic waterways. You have the English Channel right here, the Strait of Gibraltar here, and then the Dardanelles and Bosporus Strait. So a strategic waterway means that this is going to be a place that's very important to control, especially when it comes to warfare and or trade. So for example, the English Channel. If you're at war with Germany, like in World War II, Germany really has two ways they could get to the ocean because they were allies with Italy. So they could either put their navy up here and try to sail out this way, but since the British were fighting them, they could block off the English Channel, forcing the Germans to have to go north and add more miles, so of course, to their voyage. But also the British were able to put a naval blockade up here as well. And then the British also controlled the Strait of Gibraltar. So again, if you're Germany and you put your navy down here in the Mediterranean, you're going to have to fight through the British to get through this small strait. And then if you're Russia, you need the Black Sea so you can have access to the Bosporus and Dardanelles Strait to get to the Mediterranean. And so Germany was fighting Russia in World War II, so Germany could have cut off this strait to keep Russia from being able to get out as well. So this is why Germany, like in World War II, created a lot of U-boats so they could go underneath these naval blockades the British had set up. So strategic waterways you want to control for trade and also warfare. So again, the English Channel separates Britain and France. It's 21 miles wide at the narrowest point. It averages more about 50 miles wide. So here you can see the strait here. So Dover and Calais is the narrowest point. You can see the current shooting through there as well. And that's where the channel is as well. So if you want to ride the train connecting England to France, that's where you're going to go across. So the channel, so it's just a train tunnel that was dug out and goes underneath the ocean. So it's not actually in the water. So it starts going underground just north of Folkestone that comes out near Calais, France. And there you can see side profile where they actually dug out the tunnel and connected it together. All right, and then the Strait of Gibraltar. This connects the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean. And this is the most important one to really have, because if you control the Strait of Gibraltar, you control the entire Mediterranean Sea and all of the countries that border the Mediterranean and their access to the Atlantic Ocean. So, I mean, this is, strategically speaking, huge. At its narrowest point, it's 8 miles wide, separating Africa from Europe. So you can see side profile, Africa's on the left, Europe is on the right. And then the Rock of Gibraltar is also owned by the UK. They've had it for 300 years. Go back to this real quick. The Rock of Gibraltar is right over here. So they've controlled that, which of course allows them to control that strait as well. It's also the only place in Europe you'll see wild monkeys, in case you want to see wild monkeys in Europe. All right, Bosporus and Dardanelles Strait. This connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Now, of course, once you get to the Mediterranean, you need to be able to get to the Atlantic Ocean, or you can go through the Suez Canal in Egypt and get to the Red Sea, which connects to the Indian Ocean. But that connects basically Asia Minor, which is Turkey, to Europe. All right, then islands, your island groups in the north, we got Great Britain, Ireland, and Iceland. So remember, Great Britain is the name of an island. So this whole island is called Great Britain, but it's home to England, Wales, and Scotland on that island. And then, so again, Great Britain's the island. The United Kingdom, though, is this. So the United Kingdom is Wales, Scotland, England, and Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland is, of course, on the island of Ireland, but it's technically separate from Ireland. So Northern Ireland's part of the UK, along with England, Scotland, and Wales. So if that's not confusing, shouldn't be. All right, and then other islands in the south of the Mediterranean we're not really going to talk about. Probably the only one that may come up is Sicily. That's part of Italy. It's the football that the boot is kicking, basically. But Corsica, Sardinia, and Crete, we won't really talk about that much, but they are big islands in the Mediterranean. And then capitals on the rivers, just know obviously especially your capitals are going to be along rivers because these cities are old, 1,000 to 2,000 years old. And so rivers were key for transportation, of course, for food, sanitation, things like that. And so all these cities are on major rivers going through their country, such as the Spree, Moscow River, the Tiber, the Danube, the Seine, the Vltava, the Thames, things like that. All right, mountains. We have the Alps, which is the biggest mountain range in Europe. The Alps are very steep. Northern Italy, Switzerland, Austria, France is where they're located. But it's not a very big chain. So as you can see here, it goes from east to west, basically. But it's not very wide. By bus, it only takes about an hour and a half to drive through at its widest point, which I've driven through this part and this part over here. This part only takes about 45 minutes. So it's not a very wide chain, but it is a great barrier. So this is a natural barrier for Italy. So when Rome was developing and turning into an empire, this was a great barrier for them. They didn't really have to worry that much about an army coming through the north and invading them. And of course, it wasn't until later till your Germanic tribes invade Rome and take it over, but that was a long time after they had developed into a large empire. And so there's a picture in the Alps, and that's Matterhorn, one of the most famous mountains in the Alps. Not the tallest, but it's one of the coolest looking ones. All right, then you have the Pyrenees Mountains that separate France and Spain. These are much smaller, as you can see going along right here, more of an arid region. All right, and then going back to the Alps, a little interesting history. Hannibal, this is going back to 2,100 years ago. Hannibal was a leader of a town called Carthage, North Africa, and they were fighting Rome for power over the Mediterranean. So they fought over Sicily and stuff like that. Well, Hannibal, he wanted to take over Rome, but he didn't want to sell directly to Rome. He wanted to surprise them. And so what he decided to do was go to Spain and then march through the Alps and come down. So he took with him 30,000 men and 30 elephants, had to go through the Pyrenees and the Alps. So you can see here. So here's Carthage, there's Rome, and he went over to Saguntum in Spain and then marched through the Pyrenees and then up through the Alps and then came into Italy. And he, ravaged the Romans through the countryside of Italy, actually, defeating them every which way. But he wasn't able to take over Rome. He didn't have the kind of army to be able to take over a city like Rome. And so he ended up being defeated by the Romans, but the reason why this is important going into like the physical geography, because Rome was able to defeat Hannibal and then take over Carthage, and they controlled this area and then control Sicily, that gave them control of this entire area of the Mediterranean. So now Rome is able to control all of North Africa, all of the Iberian Peninsula, going into Gaul, which is present-day France, and then coming through this area. So this is what catapulted Rome from being a republic, in an area just controlling basically the Italian peninsula, to an empire and starting to take over large regions. And then they started moving east and did the same thing. Control the Mediterranean, you control all the countries around it. So Hannibal was hell-bent on destroying Rome, and actually he helped them become much stronger after they were defeated. All right, the Ural Mountains, last mountain chain we'll mention. Ural Mountains are in Russia, and this is the dividing line between Europe and Asia. So this is what, as geographers, we use to separate Europe and Asia. So once you cross over the Ural Mountains, you're into Asian Russia. And then this side of the Ural Mountains, you're in European Russia. All right, climate and vegetation. So Europe is middle and high latitude. So northern Europe, so Scandinavia, for example, is going to be tundra, subarctic climates. You're going to see a lot of permafrost. Western Europe, as I mentioned earlier, is the rich part of Europe. That's marine west coast climate. So to put that in U.S. terms, that would be like San Francisco to Seattle, kind of that area. So cool summers. Winters don't get that cold either, though. A good amount of rain, things like that. Depending where you're at. Like Spain doesn't get a lot of rain. Southern Europe has a Mediterranean climate. It's around the Mediterranean. This is going to be similar to Los Angeles and San Diego. So again, summers, mid 80s or so. Winters in the 40s and 50s. So a good climate year round for the most part. And actually a lot of the same kind of crops you would see in Southern California, you see in the Mediterranean area of Europe. So very, very similar in the way it looks and feels and the things that grow and stuff like that. All right, things that affect climate in Europe. So these are the big ones that affect climate in Europe. The topography, the wind currents, of course, the westerlies warm Europe up. The ocean currents is going to be the North Atlantic drift, which is the Gulf Stream, is going to keep them warm as well. The zones of latitude, obviously, the further north you go, it's going to get colder. And then elevation, so you can be in a place like Greece, which is far south, and get pretty hot. But high up in the mountains in northern Greece, you can go snow skiing in the winter. So they do have various climates throughout the area. So as I mentioned, the wind currents. So again, just know the westerlies coming from the U.S. over to Europe warm them up. The North Atlantic drift, which is the same thing as the Gulf Stream, warms them up as well, as you can see here. All right, so the question you need to answer, if you didn't answer it already, is in what ways has the physical geography and climate of Europe been an advantage or disadvantage for the people who live there? So looking at things like the North Atlantic drift I just mentioned, the westerlies, the Northern European plain, the fact they have a lot of peninsulas, the mountains, things like that. So you just write about a third a page to half a page on this prompt. All right, that's it for physical geography of Europe.